Welcome to the 10-Minute Treasure. My name is Jeff Pospisil, and my hope is that this video is helpful to you and your church. I'm going to be looking at donor restrictions and if they are legally enforceable. So if you raised money for a specific purpose, can you change that purpose? Or maybe somebody left you a bequest. How can you change that? Or if somebody just gave you a gift and they gave it for a specific purpose, how legally enforceable are those? And that's what we're going to look at. Just a reminder before we get into the legal part of this is that there's a difference between legal and moral. And we all know this, that there's some things that are legal but not moral. And so you just never want to be seen like this guy. This guy's from Home Alone 2. He's the sticky bandit. You don't want to be seen like a thief or somebody that's a crook. Just by the way, did you know that there's like 6 Home Alone movies? We just ran into that the other day, and I was just kind of surprised that they made so many of them. I've only watched the first 2, so that's why you get this guy. So anyway, keep that in mind. Difference between legal and moral. From a legal standpoint, one of the most important things is to have a written record of those donor restrictions. So I love this quote by Harvey Mackay, by the way. Pale ink is better than the most retentive memory. If it is written down, you can look it up. Just be darn sure you write it down. It's amazing how often I've fallen into this trap, and others have too, where you think you'll remember it. It was a significant gift. You think you're going to remember it, but our memories are not reliable, especially not as reliable as writing. And so the most important thing from a legal standpoint is what was in writing at the time of the gift. So if you were raising money, so what did you put in writing before the donors if you were raising money for a purpose? If somebody left you a bequest, what is in the will? If somebody gave you a gift, what is in writing about that restriction? So anyway, just have a written record, and it needs to be at the time of the gift. That's what matters. It doesn't matter so much about afterwards, but especially at the time of the gift. So who actually enforces the donor restrictions? Is it up to the donor to sue you? Is it up to the IRS? Who is it up to? In most states, it's going to be the Attorney General. And this happens to be a picture of the late Wayne Stenhjem, who was the North Dakota Attorney General for many years and just recently passed away unexpectedly. But in most states, that is going to be the go-to person, or the go-to office is the Attorney General if a donor restriction is going to be enforced. But what if you really, really want to change the restriction? So you got a pile of money for whatever reason, and the donor restriction, maybe it's no longer relevant or no longer practical, or whatever reason it is, you do not want to follow that donor restriction anymore. What do you do legally to change that donor restriction? So let's go ahead and run through an example of what this might look like in a church. So this happens to be a picture of Chris from Vermilion United Methodist Church. And Chris, he's a very talented organist. And that's a big part of this church is the organ. So let's just say, for example, this is not real, but let's say somebody gave $1 million and they set it up as an endowment in 1995. And this endowment, what the donor restriction is to make the distributions to maintain the organ and compensate the organist. And each year that endowment generates about $45,000. So those are the donor restrictions that we have to deal with. And let's say for whatever reason, maybe the church burns down, or the organ finally goes out of style. They don't have an organ, and they don't have an organist. And now they got $1 million endowment and $45,000 a year being generated off that, and no way to use it. So then what do you do? So the first legal remedy you can do is you can approach the donor. So let's just say it was Rick Pittenger. He's a retired pastor. He served Vermilion United Methodist Church. I bet you if Rick had an extra $1 million, he would set up an endowment for that organ. So anyway, so what you do is you would approach the donor, but if there is mutual agreement between the donor and the church, you can change that donor restriction. So it has to be mutual agreement. So the donor can't just change the restriction. The church just can't change it. They have to agree on a change. And then you want to document that, and you want to keep that along with it, whatever records you have about the original restriction. So that is a perfectly legal remedy. But now let's just say that Rick passes away. Now what do you do? I mean, you can't come to any kind of mutual agreement with the donor because our church doesn't believe in seances. So anyway, then we have to go to the next step. What about going to the family of the deceased donor? Is that a legal option to change donor restriction? And the answer is no. No, you can't. The family is not allowed to change the donor's restriction. That's just not a legal option. One of the things I think about, though, and this probably depends on the size of the gift and the relationship of the family with the church and everything else. The family is going to be the one that's most likely to cause a stir if you change the donor restriction. So if the family is on board with changing the donor restriction, even though it's not legal, so I'm going to put a caution sign there, maybe you can do that and just document it. I would document the family's agreement, although again, it's not a legal solution to this. You're going to do it, and you're going to hope that nobody tries to enforce the donor restriction on you. Another option that you can do, and this only works for certain funds, but you can notify the Attorney General, because the Attorney General is the one that enforces donor restrictions. I think all states have approved some version of UPMIFA, and I don't remember exactly what it is, but it's basically the process for how to change a donor restriction. So I will put a link in the description to the North Dakota and South Dakota UPMIFA rules that are adopted into Century Code, but every state, it's going to be a little bit different. So for the Dakotas, if the restriction is impractical, impossible, or wasteful, that is a good valid reason to seek to change the donor restriction. The amount has to be less than $25,000 in North and South Dakota. So these are for smaller ones, but less than $25,000. And it doesn't matter if the donor is living or not living. This is still the process. And then it has to be older than 20 years ago. So this one for the Vermilion Church, this wouldn't actually work for the Vermilion Church because it's much greater than that $25,000, even though it is older than 20 years. And even though it is now impossible if you don't have an organ. And the last option that I see is to take it to court. And I think you have to work through the Attorney General on this too. The Attorney General is the one that has standing when it comes to donor restrictions. I don't remember exactly why that's the case, but even in many states, the donor doesn't even have standing to enforce the restriction. It's the Attorney General that does. So you'll have to work through the Attorney General, likely, bring it to court to get that legally changed. I'm going to put somewhat of a plug for the Dakota's Minnesota Methodist Foundations here, partially because they are really good about maintaining donor intent, so keeping those records. They are also really good about helping donors craft their intent, because that can be tricky, because you have to think about not only what are the circumstances today, but over the years, do we give the leadership of the church or the ministry enough latitude to adapt the purpose of that gift to fit the current circumstances? So they're really good about that. But also there's different rules when it comes to foundations. So whether it's a community foundation or in this case the Methodist Foundation, they have a little bit more latitude to adjust donor intent. So for example, if a church closes, they can, instead of that endowment just going to waste, they can repurpose it. There's some legal standing for them to be able to adjust that donor intent when the purpose no longer exists. So another good option. All right, I hope this video has helped you. Again, I appreciate if you like, subscribe, share, comment. And again, this is a ministry of the Dakota's Conference of the United Methodist Church, as well as the Dakota's Minnesota Methodist Foundations. right. God bless you. Till next time.